in the productive landscape of the Limestone Coast in the southeast corner of South Australia. The concept arose from a Limestone Coast Development Forum in 2012, and in 2014, through funding from PIRSA's Premium Food and Wine Innovation Cluster, the group was formed, whose focus was to work in a number of areas to develop a deeper understanding of the region's red meat industry, build innovation, grow profitability, and enhance skills. The overreaching aim of the red meat cluster is to increase the size and value of the red meat industry in the Limestone Coast. To do this, the red meat cluster brings together the entire red meat value chain and delivers collaborative projects that target barriers to profitability. By promoting collaborative solutions to common problems, the red meat cluster aims to improve business profitability, which leads to more efficient, sustainable and ultimately more productive, valuable regional industry. The Limestone Coast Red Meat Cluster is overseen by an industry-wide strategy group with representatives from across the industry, including producers, transport, banking, local council, processing, retail, research and extension. Tonight's topic, which focuses on the lamb rib fracture project, is a great example of how the Limestone Coast Red Meat Cluster is collaborating with a number of different sectors of the red meat value chain to address a problem. Importantly, it is a problem that is impacting the bottom line of both processors and producers. The rib fracture project is a partnership between processors, producers, scientific and research institutions, industry bodies, with the support of state and local governments. This is the value of a cluster approach in bringing together the supply chain to address a problem with an outcome that benefits all sectors. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Kirsty Cordon. Kirsty came from a farming background near Strathalbyn, South Australia, which has led her to a lasting interest in primary production, agriculture and animal health. As a result, she pursued study in agriculture science at CSU Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. Upon graduation, Kirsty pursued a passion for horses and managed thoroughbred stud farms and trained a few racehorses. Curiosity and a thirst for further knowledge in animal health and performance and a continued passion for agriculture led her to return to tertiary studies at the University of Adelaide to pursue a veterinary medicine later in life. After working in private practice in southern Queensland and the Adelaide Hills, Kirsty decided to return to Strathalbyn and take on the role of the Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance Program Manager with PIRSA in early 2017. So tonight, Kirsty will present an overview of the Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance Program, which she currently manages. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Tiffany. It's Colin back again. Just before we hear from Kirsty, I just want to grab some feedback from the audience out there tonight, and I'm just going to launch a few polls to get some feedback on. The first one I'd like your feedback on, simply do this by clicking on your screen. Where are you listening from tonight? So just take a moment to click those options, and this will give Kirsty and our second speaker, Colin, some feedback on the audience tonight. So I'll just give you a few more moments to click on those options. Okay, so the results show that 50% of the audience is from that southeast region, and the majority of the rest is really from all within South Australia. And there's a couple of you coming from other parts of South Australia. So just another background poll question. What's your occupation? Primary producer, consultant, advisor? Are you in the agribusiness sector? Are you a researcher, or are you a student? Again, if you'd all just like to click on the screen and provide us with that feedback. So I can see that most of you are, 64% of you tonight are primary producers and 28% are consultants, and the remainder of the group is made up by researchers. Okay, the last polling question as a bit of context for this evening is a question specific to the topic. Have you had a trace back or been aware of rib fractures in your lambs? Yes, no, or unsure. I'll give you a few more moments. I can see that 3/4 of you have clicked there. All right, most of you have voted, so I'll close that one off. And the results there show that 33% of you have had a traceback, but about 50% of you have said no, and the remainder aren't sure. So what I'm going to do now, folks, is I'm just going to pass the baton across to Kirsty, and we will learn about her PIRSA surveillance program.
Thanks, Carolyn. I don't have anything on my screen here.
Are you there, Kirsty? We can see your screen. We just need to see your PowerPoint. Have you got it there?
Oh, it's up on my screen. Sorry, Carolyn. I can't see your...
Oh, I'll try. No, you should have presenting.
No, I've got nothing.
I'll try again. Sorry, folks. Just one moment.
There we are. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Here's Kirsty.
Can you see that? Can you see that now?
Yes, away you go.
Excellent. Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, Tiffany, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name's Kirsty Cordon, and I'm here today to give you a brief talk about the South Australian Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance Program. I'll give you some background information on the program, why these conditions that we monitor are important, and how the data is collected, fed back to producers, and how to interpret the results. I'll also touch on areas where the data is used, and this rib fracture research is a very good example of this. It's also worth noting that each state monitors and reports on endemic diseases and conditions very differently compared to South Australia, and we are very unique in the data that we collect and the methods that we use to distribute this information directly back to the producers. So what are the aims of our program, and why is it important? So, I mean, it's simply a direct feedback system from the processing plant to producers that just lets them know what diseases and conditions were found in their line of sheep, with the ultimate aim of improving stock health and welfare and to maximise productivity, and in producing a consistent quality product, just like cans of Coca-Cola, which means improving everyone's bottom line at the end of the day. And this cannot be achieved without the knowledge that the conditions exist in the first place. And indirectly, the program assists the sheep industry broadly by reducing waste within the red meat value chain, provides data and trend information for research projects, and is also there to support market access into the future. The conditions monitored are not notifiable, and there are no compliance or fines associated with what we do. The program is a collaboration between a few different parties, and it's been operating since 2007 at both Thomas Foods International exporting processing plants, where there's one located at Abattoir in the Adelaide Hills, and the other one is at Murray Bridge. We're the only state in Australia that is fortunate enough to be predominantly funded directly by industry, that is the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, which is managed by SASAG, or the South Australian Sheep Advisory Group, with a smaller national contribution from Animal Health Australia. So the program looks at 21 different diseases or conditions that are detected at slaughter, and we provide feedback to producers consigning these lines. So just to let you know that South Australia is currently the only state collecting information on rib fractures, so it is not known how common and widespread the issue is in other parts of Australia, but we suspect it's not just a South Australian problem. The reason that we're finding it here is because we're actively looking for it and reporting on it, but we just don't know to what extent interstate lambs are affected at this point in time. And without this data, we would not be aware that conditions such as rib fractures are such a significant issue that warrants further investigation. So on your screen, you can see these are some of the conditions that we monitor. On the far left-hand side, you've got a grass seed abscess, which would require a significant amount of trim that would lose that entire brisket, depending on how far that abscess tracked. In the middle, we've got some dog bites, and on the far right-hand side, some bruising. So the grass seed abscesses you might not be aware of. The dog bites, they are quite obviously severe, but quite preventable, and the bruising until they're processed, the producers are unaware that these conditions exist. So I'll just go a little bit into how our program works, and we'll just highlight how we collect the data on the processing floor and get the information back to the sheep producers. So the program provides an additional meat inspector on the ground, covering both shifts at Murray Bridge and the one shift that's operated at Abattoir, to help collect the data and feed it back to us so we can pass the information back to producers within just a week or so after they've been processed. So on the processing floor, this team of meat inspectors work together, inspecting and checking the red and green offal trays and each carcass as it moves along the chain. At the end of each individual consignment, they record an estimated percentage of each of the conditions present within the line. The meat inspectors are asked to record this estimate starting from 5% and in increments of 5%, as we want to provide feedback on flock issues, not individual condemnations or very low prevalent issues where just a few sheep are affected, and the condemnation information is given directly by the processor, so we feel as though we don't need to provide that again. All lines are monitored. However, we only request that lines over 100 head at Murray Bridge and more than 50 head at Abattoir are reported back to the producer. And for any of you who have had the chance to be on the processing floor will appreciate how fast the chain moves. So it becomes extremely difficult to accurately estimate a trend in a small line when the line starts and stops in a matter of minutes. And of course, if there are major issues in these small lines, it is recorded, but it's just not necessarily, these lines just generally aren't reported back. These estimates are information collected, and the information collected by the meat inspectors is then emailed to us at PIRSA, where it is validated, which basically means that the PIC numbers are cross-checked to ensure that they match the owner or the trading name supplied by the processor. And the purpose of this is to ensure that the correct information is sent to the correct owner of the sheep. This client confidentiality is a critical aspect to the integrity of this program, and we are very fortunate to be in the position to cross-check with the PIC information held by government, where we hold the database information for the state. So in regards to feedback, a producer receives a letter with all the information relating to their line. The number at the bottom is the percent of the line affected. So in this case, 5% of the line was found to have rib fractures. That's not 5 animals affected, that's a percent. And bladderworm 10%, sheep measles 5%. Feedback is only provided when a condition is detected in 5% or more, and we currently do not provide information on clean lines. And likewise, feedback is not sent if a producer does not consign the sheep directly to the processor. And although sale yard lines are monitored, there is no traceback. And just to let you all know that clean lines and results will soon be available via email notification in the near future, in addition to postal letters. So clean line information will soon be available. And just an example of our fact sheets that we also send out. So for any positive conditions, a fact sheet is provided with each letter, which describes in limited detail what is found. So the fact sheet tells you about what the condition is, why it's important, and what impacts it has both on farm and during processing, and what might the cause be, treatment, management, and prevention options. This is a fairly generic source of information and should be used as a starting point when considering your approach to management and control strategies, and is useful as a discussion point when involving advisors or vets when further assistance is needed to tailor a strategy that suits your own individual production and management system for a particular issue that you might have been notified of that you might want to do something about. So we send out a lot of these letters. So this table has been created just to try and make sense of some of the rather long list of conditions, and where we've divided it into where the effects are seen. So there are some conditions that predominantly have an effect on farm, whereas at the processor, from a producer's point of view, they have little or no effect, so cirrhosis, nephritis and lungworm. These are conditions that affect offal, such as the liver and the kidneys. However, it's important to still remember that these conditions result in industry waste that is in the rendering of offal, and that would normally end up as a saleable product. There are other conditions that have little or no effect on farm. However, the impact on the carcass at the processor is quite significant. So things like ovis, bladderworm, vaccination lesions, dog bites don't necessarily affect the productivity of sheep on farm, but there is a lot of wastage during processing. And the final category are those conditions that have an impact at both a farm and processor level, and the most significant of these is grass seeds, pleurisy and arthritis, and you'll notice that rib fractures, cheesy gland and jaundice are also on that list. So it just highlights the importance of the work that Colin's doing and the impact of rib fractures in sheep in South Australia. So any part of the carcass that is defective must be removed to satisfy the customer's requirements, and the amount of trim removed to obtain this can be quite significant. Loss of trim not only reduces carcass weight but also incurs grid penalties, downgrading to a lower value, often frozen product, rather than a high value chilled product. And worst case scenario, the entire carcass can be condemned at times. So if we consider arthritis, this can have both significant economic consequences on farm and during processing. So the on-farm impacts include poor growth and reduced productivity of both meat and wool, a failure to thrive, and they can be late finishes, possibly mortalities, and often producers are left with animals that are not fit to load to be sold anywhere, and then they have to deal with those. And of course, trim loss during the processing can lead to an entire carcass condemnation. So when they trim, they need to take back to the next clean joint. So this can mean a loss of an entire hind leg, an entire forequarter, or they can lose all of their legs, or if there are 4 or more joints involved, then the whole carcass is actually condemned. And with the feedback, conditions such as arthritis can often be reduced by looking at vaccinating, using Aerovac, which is erysipelas is the most common cause of arthritis in sheep in South Australia, looking at hygiene, at marking, looking at ways to reduce stress, and at the end of the day, maximising wound healing time. So you can see that the loss of that hind leg is a considerable loss to the producer, and it's a considerable loss of valuable product to the processor. So a little bit of research has happened with arthritis, using some of our data as well, and tail length was found to be a significant contributor to arthritis, where tail docking less than 3 vertebrae had a significant impact on the rate that the wound was healing, and it was taking a lot longer to heal. So making sure that you've got 3 or more vertebrae is important in reducing your incidence of arthritis, and could be one factor amongst many factors on farm that need to be looked at. So, so interpretation of our results, it's important to consider which diseases are present and what impact they're having to the producer or the processor. Are they homebred or bought-in sheep, and how much of a line is affected? You can have 40% of a line of bruised animals, but they may be only mildly affected, or they could be severely affected. So looking at your kill sheets, looking at your feedback information, and determining carcass weights, are they more than normal, are they well under normal, and determining where the losses could be if they're not what you expect. And you need to look at whether it's cost effective. Can you cost effectively manage your issue on farm? For a condition like sheep measles, if you've got wild dogs that are on your property that you can't control, then managing that condition may be very difficult or impossible. So just looking at all of these things in conjunction will help make management decisions a lot easier. And then I guess looking at are there sudden changes in results, or are you seeing more of a certain condition? There can be great value in that feedback going back to producers where they're alerted to a problem that they may not have had in the past. I guess in caution to that, if you don't send your sheep to a processing plant such as Thomas Foods International, where that's the only processing plant that's actively part of our program currently, they won't be receiving necessarily the same feedback. So just because you send to an abattoir and you don't get feedback doesn't mean that you don't have the condition. It just may mean that they're not monitoring for those conditions and letting you know. And in any management change, just be patient, because it may not the results may not happen overnight. It might take several years to reduce your incidence, so being prepared for that. So our ultimate aim is to provide sheep producers in South Australia with the information that they utilise on farm when making sheep health management decisions and to decrease the degree of disease on farm. So hopefully that gives you all an idea of how our producer feedback system operates here in South Australia. And I think we're going to field a few questions and then I'll hand over to Colin and he'll explain how he's used this information in his fracture research. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please feel free to leave a comment, and if you wish to know more about our feedback program or if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Kirsty. I've got a couple of questions here that the audience has typed in. The first one you might be able to answer, but Colin might also provide some insight into his presentation. And the first question says, how often is the rib damage caused in transit compared to older injuries?
That would be a Colin question. I think from our information, we don't have that sort of data, but that might be something that Colin's looked at.
Do you want to pass that one, Colin, to your presentation?
Oh, look, I can happily answer that now. I'd just say that in the study we did of 30,000 lambs at Bordertown Abattoirs, less than 1% were injuries that had been incurred during transit to the abattoirs. So, yeah, the vast majority occur on farm at an earlier age.
Okay, thanks, Colin, and we're about to gain some further insights into that shortly. There's another question here, Kirsty, in regards to your comment about tail length. The person says short tail takes longer to heal. Can you just explain your tail length comments again, please?
Yes, so from the research that was done, they made a strong correlation between a shorter tail length, less than 3 vertebrae long, and tail lengths 3 or more, and there was a definite correlation and a reduced incidence of arthritis in sheep with the longer tails than shorter, and the thoughts are that the wound takes longer to heal, so there's a longer exposure to the bacteria that's quite common in the environment, so there's more of a chance that they're going to pick that bacteria up and get the infection which causes the arthritis.
Okay, so that's just clarified that question. The person was just asking, the shorter tail takes longer to heal, and yep, you've just clarified that, so thank you. Is there any further questions from the attendees for Kirsty, or we might pick them up as we go to the end? We'll do some questions again. There's one here before Tiffany introduces Colin. So there's a question here that says, what proportion of farmers acknowledge the feedback and what proportion take corrective action that you know of, Kirsty, as a result of getting these reports from you?
I couldn't give you, I mean, we've done a survey to see what people think of our information, and that's been very positive. I do field quite a few phone calls during the week of producers ringing me about conditions that they've been notified of and they just want further clarification or some more information on. To give you I couldn't give you sort of numbers, but we do field regular calls on producers wanting more information, and we haven't really studied how many people are, I mean, I think in our survey about 40% was saying that they were making on-farm changes. That was a survey done about a year ago. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to build on that as Tiffany introduces our next speaker.
Thanks, Carlin. So our second speaker tonight is Dr. Colin Trengove. For those of you in the southeast or in South Australia, he's fairly well known. Colin is a production animal veterinarian at the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences, University of Adelaide, Roseworthy campus. He's currently finalising research towards his PhD into the cause and prevention of rib fractures in sheep. Previously, he has run his own livestock consultancy business, ProAg Consulting, as well as working in private veterinary practice as a district vet with the Department of Primary Industries, South Australia, in the southeast, mid and upper north, and Eyre Peninsula. He was also a founding director of the APAL Soil and Plant Analysis Lab based in Adelaide. So tonight Colin's going to give us an update on his PhD and his findings into the cause and prevention of rib fractures in lambs. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Carlin, and thank you for the intro, Tiff, and welcome everybody. Yes, so this, as has already been stated, this is the culmination of probably 4 years of planning and research, but my interest in rib fractures goes back beyond 25 years when I first, it was reported to me by a producer down the southeast, and so it's been an issue that's been around for a long time, but there is little awareness of rib fractures in lambs because it is not a condition that is normally recorded or reported in abattoirs generally. But as Kirsty has just highlighted, the information has now been recorded for 9 years through the Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance Program in South Australia, funded by the Sheep Industry Fund. And so it's based on that information that we've been able to, I guess, garner enough information to investigate this further. So the topics I would like to cover is firstly talking about rib fracture detection, a review of the causes based on literature, what's the results of the research done to date, and then the prevention strategies that have been developed as a result of those studies, a little bit about the cost to the industry, what's intended down the track, and of course the acknowledgements. So the Australian food standards dictate that rib fractures, or calluses as they're probably more correctly referred to, such as these in the picture in the top left-hand corner, need to be excised before the carcass is fit for human consumption. And so, for example, in the JBS at the Bordertown Abattoirs, a pneumatic saw is used to remove the damaged ribs while the lamb is, when its rib fractures are first detected, they're put onto a retain rail, the ribs are removed, and as a result of that, the rack is often compromised. And instead of being worth, say, $25 a kilogram, it's only reduced to a salvage value of probably 20% that value. So you can see here that as a result of cutting out the ribs, there's quite a hole left in the carcass where there's several ribs affected, and this results in the rack which is subsequently damaged. So both of these racks in this illustration or photo here have been compromised in the process of removing the rib fractures, and so they don't meet the market specifications. For the US market, that's a 10 centimetre length of rib, as indicated in the packaged export product on the right. And there is typically over 100,000 primal cuts downgraded annually in South Australia due to rib fractures, which is estimated to cost the South Australian red meat industry around about $3 million annually. So a review of the literature identified several potential causes. So Eagles and Small back in 2008 reported physical injury as a major cause of rib fractures in the EU and UK, especially where the ewe inadvertently steps on the lamb. They also described the influence of vitamin D, calcium and copper on bone strength and development. And Hideroglu in 1980 highlighted the importance and role of several trace elements in bone formation and development. So there's been a lot known for a long time, but little has been done to perhaps to resolve the issue. And so a research strategy was developed to examine these causes in the Australian context. Firstly, I'd like to just briefly report field observations, and I've had several of these, especially from Victoria, from veterinarians in practice, and this one from Dr. David Randell in the Hamilton practice, Livestock Logic, where he found rib fractures in a mob of lambs that were being yarded for the first time, around about 6 to 10 weeks of age, and found them collapsing with rib fractures. So in this case about 40 lambs. Rib fractures were also apparent on post-mortem, and liver copper levels were extremely low. So anecdotal evidence such as this strongly supports that copper deficiency plays a significant role or contributing to the incidence of rib fractures, and of course in this case long bone fractures as well. The map here indicates traceback data from the Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance Program, in this case in 2014 through Thomas Foods International. So 1 in 25 lambs in South Australia have evidence of broken ribs at slaughter, and about 9 in 10 properties send lambs to slaughter with evidence of broken ribs. And these come from all over the state, as indicated on the map here, where the rib fractures have been found up as far as the dog fence, indicated by the black dots on the map, as opposed to the grey dots, which represent negative feedback or properties that haven't had a problem. So this is all based on the EAS data as described by Kirsty in the previous presentation. And I guess it highlights one thing is that it's not actually unique to any part of the necessarily the higher rainfall parts of the state. And the other thing I'd like to add here is that okay, these black dots indicating rib fractures represent where the estimated prevalence has been over 5%. And in actual fact, the study I've recently completed at Bordertown shows that it's much more common than that, as you'd expect, because these dots are only representing where there's been at least 5% incidence, or prevalence, should I say. So we initially, funding was initially obtained from MLA to look at a neonatal lamb investigation several years ago, where we enrolled 29 farms in a study to test the hypothesis that rib fractures have primarily occurred during birth, as has been speculated by many producers, and due primarily to copper deficiency, which is another commonly held belief. We ended up doing 119 autopsies on lambs that were dead at birth or shortly after, and revealed only 2 with broken ribs. We also collected liver and bone and pasture samples at the same time, and we looked at various mineral associations with this condition. We found no apparent association between liver copper levels or bone density and properties that had a history of rib fractures. However, we recognised that this sample size was pretty small. A pasture analysis, however, did reveal a strong correlation between nutrient levels that we'd normally associate with soil acidity and the properties that had a history of rib fractures. And so this led to the following study here. So this plot was undertaken to explore the potential association between soil pH from soil maps produced by the CSIRO and rib fracture prevalence, so based on that EAS data from 2014. So it reveals here the prevalence of rib fractures, rib fracture positive properties, which is represented on the y-axis. So this is properties positive to rib fractures per 100 properties at risk, and then across the horizontal axis we have the soil pH, water pH. So we find a distinct correlation here where properties with a higher prevalence of rib fractures are also associated with the more acidic soil types. This is quite plausible association, given that calcium intake is critical to bone strength, and calcium deficiency is closely associated with soil acidity or increasing soil acidity. So moving on to the Abattoir study completed last spring at JBS, where we observed 30,000 lambs over a 2-week period going through along the slaughter chain, and we found that a prevalence of about just over 4% with rib fractures, but the range was from 0 to 18%. An average of 21 lambs had rib fractures per line. The average line was 500 lambs. So a line or a consignment from a property. And 90% of the properties that presented lambs during this period had lambs with rib fractures. And in fact, fractures were detected in all lines presented during that time that exceeded 260 lambs. So it was only generally the smaller lines of 100 or so where we didn't find rib fractures. A third of properties had rib fractures in excess of 5%. And an average prevalence in these lines was 8%, and this compares quite closely to an average of 9% prevalence found in the EAS studies over the last 9 years. Now this diagram may look a bit difficult to interpret initially, but what we have here is a density plot which simulates a lamb carcass hanging vertically with the head up the top end. And so the red spots here are the spine, and then we have the rib cage on both sides. So, and we can see here, there's perhaps poor to see, but the ribs numbered from 1 down to 13 on the vertical axis. And across the horizontal axis, we have the centimetres from the spine out to the exterior of the rib cage, out here at 16 centimetres. The illustration is representing over nearly 1,300 lambs with rib fractures, and the increase in density represents where the more prevalence, or where rib fractures were found to be more prevalent. So it's highlighting that if we look across here, that most of the rib fractures are occurring between ribs 8 and 10 on both sides, on the left and right side. And the rib fractures are occurring on average, or mostly, between about 10 and 14, 15 centimetres from the spine, so getting close to the exterior of the rib cage. To illustrate it another way, graphically, look at an anatomical diagram of a lamb, and we see that about 75% of rib fractures occurred on ribs 8, 9 and 10, around about 10 to 14 centimetres. So that's where these yellow stars are representative. And so why were most of the rib fractures occurring in this area? Well, if you look at the anatomy of the lamb, we find that effectively the first 7 ribs are largely protected by the shoulder and foreleg, and the last 3 ribs are really are somewhat more protected because they're tucked in over the abdomen. And so it's the ribs 8, 9 and 10 which are the most vulnerable to any sort of injury. And so this would indicate that physical injury must be playing a role in this, because it's obviously affecting the ribs that are most vulnerable. So looking at the on-farm survey, so during the Abattoir study of 30,000 lambs, that represented 75 lines from 60 properties. And so an on-farm property survey was conducted amongst those 60 producers. And the findings to date indicate that over 90% were at risk to copper deficiency, based on primarily on the soil analysis. And looking more closely at the soil analysis, we see that nearly 3/4 of the properties had copper potential, or at risk to copper deficiency, based on interaction with iron or molybdenum, which were there in excess. Just over half the properties had acid soils, and an acid soil was defined using the pH in water of being less than 6.3. 72% had what is considered calcium deficiency, which correlates with, I guess, closely with an acid soil, although sometimes you can have an alkaline soil due to an excess of potash or magnesium, but still have a calcium deficiency, and that's why the discrepancy between these two figures. 19 properties had more than 5% rib fractures, which is that same criteria used for the EAS data, and of these 19 properties, 100% were deficient in either calcium, copper or both. And the copper deficiency, in this case, 89% were deficient due to the interaction with iron and molybdenum, which I think draws to an important point here, because during the survey they found that several producers were spreading copper as a fertiliser, partly to prevent perhaps the occurrence of rib fractures. But if it's a copper-induced deficiency due to an iron excess or a molybdenum excess, or for that matter a sulphur excess, that copper fertiliser won't have any, or have minimal impact on improving the copper status of the animals grazing that pasture. For those that are more statistically inclined, looking at some of the correlations in the soil analysis, we find strong correlations between iron, calcium, soil pH, and for that matter organic carbon, and the prevalence of rib fractures. And you might say, what does that represent? Well, in actual fact, iron increases, and calcium or pH and organic carbon all tend to decrease with increasing soil acidity. So that's quite a a significant correlation and sort of backs up the data that I presented in the previous slide. And also the fact that increasing iron associated with increasing acidity is also, it ties up the copper and so reduces copper availability. So the conclusion from this data so far is that rib fractures are mainly due to initially, I think, an underlying issue is handling or accident, and so that's why we tend to see rib fractures from sheep presented to slaughter from all over the state. But we do see a higher prevalence of rib fractures occurring in lines from, for example, Kangaroo Island, the Fleurieu Peninsula, and the mid and lower southeast. In other words, generally the higher rainfall areas of the state. And this I put down to being more commonly associated with calcium and or copper deficiency. And there is also in the literature the issue of vitamin D deficiency, which can predispose to bone fragility, although I didn't look at that in this particular study. So as we, in the process of doing the on-farm investigation, looking at how we may prevent rib fractures, I saw a vast array of different handling equipment, and one of the criticisms, once again levelled by producers, has been is that a result of the increasing incidence of mechanical handling devices in more recent times. However, the rib fracture distribution was such that it was on average there was only about 2 rib fractures per lamb, and so it represented more of a pinpoint injury rather than a crushing injury. And so, for example, the use of these mechanical or hydraulically operated capturing devices I don't see as being a significant issue in the incidence of rib fractures. I see it as more a problem with perhaps particular sharp points or sharp objects that might be impinging on the lamb as they run past, or getting squashed against a post by the ewe, or similar sort of episodes. And so there is obviously an opportunity in many yards to improve the quality of the equipment and reduce the risk of rib fractures. So for example, this illustration here on the bottom right, where we have a good flow into a narrow raceway to prevent the animals sort of being too abreast in the raceway, but also no sharp objects which might impinge on a rib in the process of going in there. And then on the bottom left we have rubberized drafting gates, which also will tend to reduce the risk of breaking ribs through the drafting process, which I thought sure could be an issue. So I see interim advice on how rib fractures can be prevented. One is to ensure that there's adequate calcium and copper uptake by the animal. I do specifically refer to uptake as opposed to intake, because it may go into the rumen, but it doesn't necessarily get into the animal, because copper and sulfur and iron and molybdenum can all combine to form an insoluble complex, and so it's not absorbed by the animal. So in other words, we really need to be ideally basically putting copper through either a bolus dose to ensure that enough gets absorbed out of the rumen, or preferably perhaps as an injectable form, so that it's bypassing the tie-ups that can occur in the rumen. So how do we know if the animals are getting an adequate calcium or copper uptake? So a soil test to check the need for whether there is a calcium deficiency, and so there may be a benefit in providing either lime or dolomite or gypsum, depending on the circumstance. We can do blood tests on ewes at around joining time, because you really need to establish the copper status of the ewe. I think a lot of these deficiencies may be occurring during pregnancy, and so the lambs are being born perhaps with copper deficiency and or calcium deficiency, and are so more fragile to injury thereafter. So checking the EU copper status at joining, which is obviously often in spring or thereafter, depending on when lambs are proposed to be born. Alternatively, doing a pasture test when you've still got green feed on offer in spring, to assess if there is a risk of copper, sulfur, iron and molybdenum tie-ups occurring, or interactions which can induce copper deficiency. So by doing a pasture test, we can make an assessment about the likely availability of copper in that circumstance. And if we find that there is a potential for interactions, we're likely to see a copper deficiency induced, well then we would need to ensure that copper is given directly to the animal, as opposed to being applied as a foliar spray on pasture or as a fertiliser additive onto the soil. and an additional check of lamb copper, and for that matter other trace elements, could be warranted at marking or weaning to see how their status is progressing. The next issue I see is important to preventing rib fractures, and this is perhaps the wider issue of I think a lot of properties that are having 1%, 2% or 3% with rib fractures is probably primarily due to handling issues, and so adopting management strategies to minimise the risk of lamb trauma. So being gentle when handling, because if you ever do a post-mortem on a lamb, or for that matter, you may have noticed that sometimes you don't have to put too much pressure on the rib cage to break a rib. And so being gentle, realising that lambs are quite fragile at an early age. Perhaps reviewing the use of dogs in yards. I'm not saying that all dogs are bad, because I realise that if the animals are acclimatised to dogs, that's a help, but lambs are usually quite skittish and are probably more prone to jumping on top of each other or injuring each other, or getting injured as a result of the access to dogs. Another issue is minimising the need to yard lambs, so only perhaps dividing the lambs up and only drafting off the heavies to go to slaughter rather than having them all in the yards each time for yarding, although I did find in the survey that there wasn't a distinct correlation between the number of times lambs were yarded and the incidence of rib fractures. And the final point there is attending to hazards in the yards. So any situation in the yards that might be predisposing to rib fractures should be eliminated. I appreciate that's easily said, not necessarily easily done. Now to finish up with just the cost of rib fractures. So firstly, there's three aspects to this: the producer, the process, the producer and the industry. So the processor initially, so based on estimates from JBS, on average, killing several thousand lambs a day, that chain disruption as a result of having to trim lambs with rib fractures results in about $1,500 a day on average. The discount caused by lambs with rib fractures, discounted rack of lamb, resulting in about $4,500 a day. As I said, it can reduce the value of a rack by 80% if it's been damaged in the process of trimming. And this all equates to around about $25 per lamb with rib fractures, a cost of $25 per lamb with rib fractures. If we look at the cost to the producer, we see here that it's estimated that rib fractures will reduce the growth rate of lambs by around about 3 weeks. I mean, this will depend on whether you've got 1, 2, 3 or 10 ribs affected, which, looking at the value of the pasture grown, may equate to around about $1.30 per head. There's also the trimming cost. Now, trimming, as I said, there's only an average of about 2 ribs affected per lamb, so the actual trimming doesn't cost a lot per se. It might only estimate around about $1.30 per lamb. And then the other aspect is we don't really know is what's the risk of losing sale as a result of being, I guess, a repeat offender of submitting lambs with a significant number of broken ribs. Especially with some lines of lambs having 10 or 20% of lambs affected with broken ribs. That's an unknown. And then the cost to the industry. Well, there's the welfare aspect, which that's once again it's an unquantifiable, but like all these things, it's best to address these issues early before they become an issue. From a South Australian perspective, where it's estimated about 3 million lambs are killed annually, if we base it on the 4% prevalence discovered in this study and the $25 cost per lamb with a rib fracture, that works out about $3 million a year to the industry, and that figure can be arrived at through the various calculations, and it comes to a similar figure. If we expanded that to this Australian situation where we have about 21, 22 million lambs killed annually, that could be costing the industry over 20 million a year. But as Kirsty referred to, we don't have the data on the prevalence of rib fractures in other states because it's not information that's collated. And so unless studies are done interstate, we won't be able to quantify that figure further. So looking at further research, also looking to do further ageing of fractures and mineral studies on the bone composition of lambs that have got weak bones as opposed to strong bones. Refining that advice to producers that I just outlined previously, and looking at perhaps ideally doing similar studies in other states. And finally, ultimately, we want to improve the abattoir feedback to producers, and so any feedback that producers have on that matter would be much appreciated. So in finishing, I'd just like to acknowledge my PhD supervisors, MLA, JBS and PIRSA, for their assistance through the various means. There's also the National Sheep Industry, Animal Health Australia through their abattoir surveillance, the Sheep Industry Fund for the EAS funding on an ongoing basis, TFI for their assistance, SAMRI, and also Professor Mark Stevenson for their help with some of the studies done. So on that point, I would like to finish up and say thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions. Over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Colin. I've got a couple of questions here. One related back to when you were talking about the initial copper deficiency slide. So the question was, did you verify copper deficiency in the lambs by blood or tissue testing as opposed to soil testing, which does not necessarily reflect the actual animal status? And I then think in your presentation you went on to talk about actual blood testing from the animals at marking. I think you talked about it as well.
Yes, yes, that's a good point. Now, what we did do, so the 60 producers, we sampled 5 livers from each line of lambs as they came through. And admittedly, so this was in late November, early December, and we found a third of the properties had evidence of deficiency. So in other words, one or more of the livers that we sampled was grossly deficient in copper. And so I thought that was interesting in that by the time we get to late November, December, we may not necessarily, it's not the peak time necessarily for seeing copper deficiency, but the fact that we found a third of properties at that one point in time had evidence of copper deficiency was quite relevant. And so, yeah, it's a fair comment that obviously testing livers is the ideal, that's, I guess, the gold standard for finding, in particular, copper deficiency. But we can make some various predictions from soil and from that, for that matter, from pasture analysis on the likelihood of copper deficiency occurring. But there's no doubt liver sampling, either at slaughter or doing a biopsy technique, getting your local veterinarian to do a biopsy on, say, 7 to 10 animals, is perhaps the most direct method of finding copper deficiency, and to a lesser extent the blood test is a reasonable predictor. It depends on the time of the year as to how effective the blood test is. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Just following up from that same person's just I typed in a question. Was there any correlation between the incidence of low liver copper and the incidence of rib fractures on those properties?
Yes, I've actually got the data right in front of me. So as I said, the properties that had, so there are, 18 properties that actually had copper deficiency based on liver analysis of the lambs, and it wasn't necessarily, I mean, we just sampled 5 lambs out of each line. We weren't sampling lambs that necessarily had rib fractures. So that would be a much more difficult thing to try and organise, because generally the livers are separated from the carcass before we get to diagnose the presence of rib fractures. But I did find a correlation between those with, certainly with those with low copper. Invariably, looking at the soil analysis, it was copper deficiency was predicted. But, and in actual fact, there was a high correlation between the properties that had high prevalence, in other words, greater than 5% with rib fractures, and the presence of copper deficiency. However, I can also appreciate that just sampling 5 lambs from a line at one point in time is not necessarily the best way of detecting copper deficiency. I'd think it'd be far more relevant, obviously, to be going on farm and looking at animals that might be a bit backward in condition. Obviously, the lambs that are going to slaughter are going to be the ones in best condition, and so possibly the less likely to necessarily have a copper deficiency show up.
Okay, thank you. We'll give Colin a rest for a moment. I think there's a couple of questions here that were directed back to the first presentation. Kirsty, the question was, will we find out what our loss has been on effective carcasses?
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
Will we find out what our loss has been on effective carcasses?
On affected carcasses by conditions, is that what the...
Yeah, they've written effective, but probably means affected.
Oh, sorry. We don't know exactly how much trim is taken off at processing. It's impossible to know what that would be. We don't get that feedback, and they don't record it. I mean, the line moves so quickly. There's no way. I mean, they just have to remove it and go on to the next carcass. So it's unless research gets done where you go in and you weigh and take samples to try and estimate it, but there'd be no way of knowing for your particular line how much loss there would be. I guess you're just comparing your carcass weights, looking at the conditions that were found and using the feedback to try and sort of join the dots is the best that you can do at this point in time. Yeah, without further studies, but yeah, to know losses of an individual line, I don't think that's information that we'll ever know, I guess. But yeah, I guess deducting it from the information that you presented with from your kill sheets, from the feedback, and just trying to work it out from there. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it appears that your slide about the lamb and the tail and docking it at the appropriate spot has generated a bit of discussion. So the question is,
yes,
is there a difference between using a hot knife or rings for tail docking in regard to arthritis?
That, I don't know, came out of the study. From the information that I've seen, I'm not sure that that was actually looked at, but I'm happy to look at that further if they would like to leave their information, and I can get back to them on that.
Yep. So we've got a register of those questions, Kirsty, so we'll be able to follow that up, or there might be a paper that we could send out to the participants.
Yeah, exactly.
Like so seems like that topic has drummed up a few questions, so that was good. All right.
That's great.
I think these next ones are going to come back through to you, Colin. Someone says, is there a difference between breeds, for example, Dorper, second cross merino, or pure merino? Have you noticed a trend there?
Look, it's interesting. I recorded at least 8 different breeds in the process of visiting the 60 properties, and so I think the data set's probably too small to be very conclusive. Admittedly, and I wouldn't say it's at all statistically significant, but the 5 properties that had Dorpers, none of them had rib fractures. But I might also add there that none of them submitted more than about 100. I think the biggest line of Dorpers that was submitted was about 140, and I really, based on the analysis of the data, I think any line less than about 250 lambs is probably not going to give a reliable or statistically significant result, because when we're only looking at about a 4% prevalence, you really probably need to be sampling at least 200 or probably 300 lambs before you can produce what I'd say is a statistically significant result. So it was interesting, and I also found interesting that in fact I recall several of those Dorper producers were also giving copper supplementation, and so the fact that they didn't have evidence of copper deficiency, or should I say rib fractures, may be also because of their management program as well. Only about 20% of producers in the survey were providing copper as a supplement, and I did find that some of those I would have considered at risk to copper deficiency based on the soil analysis, but they weren't presenting with rib fractures. There were others that were giving supplements and still having rib fracture problems as well. So I think the data set is too small to draw any conclusions about breed and susceptibility. Certainly there was a lot of composite bred lambs in there, as well as a mixture of British breeds and merino and as I say, Dorpers. But at this stage, the data set is too small to really draw any significant conclusions.
Okay, thanks, Colin. I've got 2 more questions here coming in. When it comes to marking, which is probably when the lambs are at their most vulnerable, they need to be drafted and often portable yards are used. What would you suggest farmers do to minimise those risks?
Okay, well, I think to my mind, invariably, I think drafting is a big risk where it is occurring, and I think it's probably just a matter of attention to detail and being careful. Now, I appreciate some of the producers have got 10 or 20,000 lambs, and it's very hard to be diligent with them like you might be with a few hundred. But basically, not rushing them into the yards, not causing them to be trampled, not sort of, and we all know experiences where even the yard setup where they're being funneled from a large catching pen into a small catching pen, lambs are invariably going to be trodden on or squashed, and that might be exacerbated by the presence of dogs. But I did actually make a subjective assessment during my survey where I noted, talking to the producers and as they detailed their management program, that some were showing a lot of attention to detail, whereas I thought others, where there might have been third parties involved or contractors or whatever, perhaps that same attention to detail wasn't necessarily there. And I found what I would say a distinct correlation between the prevalence of rib fractures and attention to detail. But I appreciate that was a very subjective assessment, so I didn't put that in my findings. However, I do think that talking to some producers, they obviously take a lot of care with their lambs at handling, and I suspect that would also be a major contributor to reduced prevalence of rib fractures if attention to detail is exercised. But all yards are going to be a unique circumstance, and it's a lot to do with producer attitudes to how they handle their stock, I think, as to the risk of rib fractures occurring.
Okay, got two more questions here waiting in the queue. So this question is a multi-mineral drench enough copper, or do you need direct copper injection with, or will a multi-mineral drench be enough?
Yeah, that's a good question. Given that there isn't actually a registered copper injection for sheep, and I know that a lot of, for example, a multi-min cattle with copper in it is used in sheep, and one of the reasons that copper injection is not registered for use in sheep, because it does cause quite an adverse reaction in the tissue, and so certainly if copper is being injected into sheep off-label, it should be injected into areas that are a low-value meat cut, in other words, up behind the ear or somewhere like that. I mean, it does also cause tissue reactions in cattle as well, so it's not that sheep are unique in that respect. So there's no doubt that injectable forms of copper are probably the most reliable way of getting copper into the system, but and there is that issue with if there's a lot of iron or molybdenum or sulfur in the diet, obviously in the form of usually in pasture intake, but it could be in some supplements as well, that is going to tie up any copper that's put into the rumen. So if we're giving an oral drench of a multi-min or a Nutrimin or whatever the product might be, you would hope that there's enough copper in there to get some absorbed before it gets tied up by other confounding products. So having said that, it's very hard to say hard and fast that any one oral product is going to do the job, and that's why I think you really need to know, at least have done a pasture analysis at some stage to work out what the status of the iron, sulfur and molybdenum is in the pasture, to work out whether the tie-ups are likely to occur. Yeah, so there's no one answer there, and I think it's part of the reason why rib fractures have been recognised as a problem for a long time, and probably will continue, because it's not a clear-cut issue to deal with. I think if we had more of access to copper in an injectable form, that would be handy. And we did do some research some years ago with glass bullets, which had copper, cobalt, selenium in them, which we found to be quite effective, but the market was never considered big enough in Australia. That I'm looking to review that circumstances. But so generally we'd say a copper drench, for example, just a straight copper sulfate drench, there's only about 1 or 2% of the copper is absorbed, but that's often enough to meet the needs of the animal for a couple of months. However, if there is, as I say, those other confounding nutrients in the diet, well, that may not be as satisfactory. It's hard to say.
It sounds like, Colin, I'm just going to put out a bit of a professional disclaimer there that people might just need to consult with their vet or their livestock consultant, because someone also has made a comment here that just need to be cautioned that copper is potentially toxic. Someone else has made that comment, so we just need to, it sounds like this is quite a complex relationship here that you're explaining. So just people might want to get some more advice on their specific situation before they go and apply this.
Yeah, look, that's a good comment. I mean, and it's the same with selenium, that selenium and copper are considered essential trace elements for normal animal production and health, but they both can be toxic if given inappropriately or in excess. And so it's not a good idea to just go out there and treat animals indiscriminately with either of those products without knowing what the risk of deficiency is in the first place. So yeah, consulting your animal health advisor is a good idea.
Okay, we'll just take one final question tonight, Colin, and the question's in regards to pasture tests. Who provides the producers with the feedback on their pasture tests, and what are the acceptable levels?
Okay, yeah, well look, there's a lot of laboratories around the country that will do a pasture analysis, and if you're looking sort of more specifically for something like selenium, you've got to be very careful because it's only required in very small amounts, and so you need to get a laboratory that does measure it down to 0.05 parts per million. But in the case of copper, I mean, all pasture analyses will look at copper, and we'd normally say that we want to see and it's not straightforward, because we'd normally say you need to have at least 5 to 7 parts per million of copper in a pasture analysis to meet the needs of an animal. But the trouble is, if there's a significant amount of iron or sulphur or molybdenum present in that sample as well, then 7 parts per million may not be enough. And so that's where you really do need an animal health or someone with an agronomy consultant's background who knows the significance of the relationship between the various confounding elements to see whether the copper is going to be there in abundance to meet animal needs. So I'd happily provide that that more detail to anyone who wants it. But otherwise, if you know someone in the animal health or agronomy line that can interpret pasture analyses, that'd be a good way to go. However, yeah, look, if anyone would like to contact me, I can certainly provide that detail.
Okay, thanks, Colin. There's a few more questions rolling in here, so we'll have a record of them, and might be best just to follow them up, because this one's going into more detail in regards to the pastures and things. So I'll provide these questions all through to Colin and Kirsty as our speakers tonight, and they can then follow you up individually, or it might be a topic that then can get passed through to Tiffany, and she might be able to coordinate another webinar via the Limestone Coast Red Meat Cluster. So thanks everyone tonight. It's been a wealth of information shared by Colin and Kirsty, and obviously 1 hour wasn't quite enough to capture all these ideas and discussions. Apologies for the technology issues in the middle of it, and thanks for those who sat with us as we problem solved that. We will work on a recording of tonight and distribute that to all those who are registered, and I'll try to edit out those awkward silences. So as you leave tonight, just to help Tiffany and the Limestone Coast Red Meat Cluster plan future webinars, could you just complete the evaluation survey that will pop up as you close your window? Thanks again to Colin and Kirsty. Tiffany, did you want to have any final comments to the group tonight? I'll hand over to you if so.
Yeah, thanks, Carlin. I'd just like to thank everybody tonight for logging on, and I hope you found it a valuable session. I think webinars are kind of a new frontier for a lot of people, and we certainly going forward in the future and working with the Limestone Coast Red Meat Cluster, we would be hoping to run some more. So we've had a lot of interest in this webinar, and thanks Carlin for recording it. And yes, as Carlin said, we'll be sending that out through the various networks. So yeah, so anyone that you know couldn't log on tonight, and perhaps let them know that there is a link available there to watch the webinar in their own time. Thanks, Carlin.
Okay, thanks everybody. Good night.